The first time Evan Carter pried open the cargo hatch of the sunken barge he'd bought for $10, he expected nothing more than rot, rust, and maybe a place to sleep. But what stared back at him from the darkness below would turn a broke, homeless 19-year-old into the center of a secret someone had tried very hard to bury, but to understand how he got there. Standing on a tilted deck above black water in the forgotten Canal district of Cleveland with nothing but a flickering flashlight and a heartbeat that wouldn't slow down, you have to go back 3 months earlier, to the moment his life quietly collapsed in a way no one noticed and no one tried to stop. Evan aged out of foster care on a gray March morning with a plastic bag of clothes, a thin envelope of paperwork, and exactly 0 people waiting for him outside the office. There was no celebration, no goodbye, just a caseworker who avoided eye contact and a rehearsed good luck that sounded more like a closing statement than encouragement. And within 2 weeks, the fragile arrangement he'd scraped together, a shared apartment with a guy he barely knew, fell apart when the roommate vanished. Overnight, taking the rent money and leaving behind unpaid bills and a landlord who didn't care about explanations, only deadlines. And just like that, Evan was out again, drifting from one temporary place to another until even those ran out and the nights got colder, longer, quieter, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you've already disappeared even while you're still walking around. He learned quickly which shelters filled up first, which convenience stores didn't chase you away if you stayed too long, which parts of the city stayed lit through the night, and which didn't. And somewhere along the way, he stopped thinking in terms of weeks or months and started thinking in terms of days survived, meals found, places to sit where no one would ask him to leave. And it was during one of those long, aimless walks along the industrial stretch near the Cuyahoga River, where rusted fences leaned inward like they were tired of standing, and old warehouses sat hollow with broken windows, like missing teeth, that he first noticed the barge, half submerged in a narrow canal that looked more like a grave than a waterway, tilted at an angle that made it seem like it had tried to sink and failed halfway. Its surface covered in peeling paint and graffiti layered so thick it looked like scars, and for a moment he didn't think anything of it because Cleveland was full of forgotten things. But then he saw the sign wired crookedly to a chain-link fence nearby. Salvage sale, $10. Liability transfer required. And he actually laughed out loud because it sounded like a joke, like someone was daring people to be stupid. But curiosity pulled him closer anyway. And when he found a city contractor sitting in a folding chair nearby, sipping coffee like this was just another routine assignment, Evan asked about it, expecting a punchline, but the man just shrugged and said, "You want it, it's yours. Sign the paper, pay the $10, and whatever happens after that is our problem." And there was something almost unsettling about how casually he said it. Like he wasn't just selling scrap metal, but passing off something heavier, something inconvenient, something no one wanted to deal with anymore. And maybe that should have been a warning. Maybe that should have been the moment Evan walked away. But when you've got $14 to your name and nowhere to sleep, the idea of owning anything, even a broken, sinking barge, starts to feel less like a bad decision and more like a lifeline. So he handed over the money without asking another question, signed a form he'd barely read, and just like that, in less than 10 minutes, he became the legal owner of something everyone else had gone out of their way to forget. And as ridiculous as it sounded, as pointless as it looked, standing there with the folded receipt in his pocket and the barge looming in front of him, Evan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility, or maybe just the illusion of it, which was enough. He spent the rest of the afternoon scavenging what he could: an old flashlight with weak batteries, a dented crowbar, a length of rope, anything that might help him explore what he now technically owned. And by the time the sun started to dip and the industrial skyline turned into a jagged silhouette against a fading orange sky, he made his way back to the canal, climbed over the fence, and stepped onto the barge for the first time, the metal groaning under his weight like it wasn't sure it wanted him there. And for a second he hesitated, looking out over the still, dark water that barely reflected anything back, thinking about how strange it was that no one had ever bothered to clear this place out, that something this large, this visible, had just been left here, untouched, unwanted. And then he shook it off because overthinking didn't get you anywhere when you were already at the bottom. And he moved forward, carefully making his way across the uneven deck until he found what he'd been hoping for: a hatch, rusted shut, half covered in debris, the kind of thing most people would overlook because it didn't look worth the effort. But Evan didn't have the luxury of ignoring possibilities, no matter how small. So he wedged the crowbar into the seam and pushed hard, the metal resisting at first, then giving just enough to make him believe it might actually open, and he kept going, muscles straining, hands slipping, until finally, with a sharp, echoing crack, the seal broke and the hatch shifted, releasing a gust of stale, trapped air that smelled like something long forgotten. And as he forced it open wider and aimed the weak beam of his flashlight into the darkness below, the light barely reaching more than a few feet, he felt that strange, creeping sensation that comes right before you realize you've stepped into something bigger than you understand. But he didn't pull back, didn't close the hatch, didn't walk away, because at 19, with nothing left to lose, the unknown doesn't feel like a threat. It feels like the only thing worth chasing. And so, without giving himself time to second-guess it, Evan Carter swung his legs over the edge and began climbing down into the cargo hold of a sunken barge that no one else wanted, unaware that the decision he'd just made would drag him into a secret buried beneath years of silence, a secret that had been waiting for someone exactly like him to uncover it. By the time Evan Carter's boots touched the floor of the cargo hold, the light from above had already faded into a dim square overhead, swallowed by a darkness that felt heavier than it should, like the inside of the barge had been sealed off from the world for years. And for a moment he just stood there in ankle-deep water, listening to the slow drip of moisture, the faint groan of metal shifting, the hollow echo of his own breathing, before forcing himself to move, sweeping his flashlight across the space and expecting nothing more than rot and debris. But what he saw made him pause, because even though most of the wooden crates had collapsed and floated in broken pieces, there was still a pattern to everything, rows that had once been organized, sections that suggested this wasn't random junk but a shipment, something planned, something placed with purpose. And as he stepped forward, carefully pushing through the water, he noticed details that didn't fit the idea of abandonment. Patches of metal less corroded than the rest, faint markings on crate fragments that looked like inventory labels rather than scrap, and that uneasy feeling crept in, the one that tells you you're standing somewhere you weren't meant to be. But Evan kept going anyway, because walking away had never gotten him anywhere. And that's when he saw it, wedged against the far wall just above the waterline. A large metal container, solid, intact, untouched by the decay around it, like it didn't belong to the same place at all. And the moment he got close enough to read the faded lettering stamped across its side, his chest tightened. Property of U.S. Department of Energy. And suddenly this wasn't just a broken barge anymore. This was something official, something controlled, something that shouldn't have been forgotten here, which raised a question he couldn't ignore. If this was important, why hadn't anyone come back for it? And before he could talk himself out of it, he grabbed his crowbar and started working at the seal, the metal resisting at first, stubborn and tight like it had been designed never to open again. But Evan pushed through, adjusting his grip, slipping once in the water, then forcing the bar deeper until finally there was a sharp crack and the lid shifted just enough for him to pull it open, the sound echoing through the hold as stale air escaped. And when he lifted his flashlight and aimed it inside, he froze, because instead of tools or scrap, there were rows of cylindrical canisters, lined up with precision, heavy-duty and identical, secured in place as if they'd been meant to survive exactly this kind of disaster. And at first he didn't understand what he was looking at, not until his eyes caught the symbols printed on their sides. Bold warning signs he recognized instantly, radiation markers, hazard labels that didn't belong anywhere near an abandoned canal. And his stomach dropped as the reality began to settle in, that whatever this was, it wasn't harmless. It wasn't something that just got misplaced. But then the beam of his flashlight shifted slightly, and that's when the real shock hit him, because some of the canisters weren't sealed, their lids open or missing entirely, and the compartments inside them were empty, completely empty. And in that moment the air seemed to thicken around him, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't fully understand but knew were bad, because empty containers meant something had either been taken or it was no longer contained. And neither option made sense in a place like this. Not in something that had been sold off for $10 like it didn't matter. And just as that thought settled in, he heard it, faint at first, almost blending into the background noise of the barge, but unmistakable once he focused on it. A slow, uneven breathing sound coming from somewhere deeper in the hold, and every instinct in his body told him to turn around, to climb back up, to leave before whatever this was got worse, but instead he stayed, turning slowly, raising the flashlight toward the darker section beyond the container where the light barely reached, his hand trembling just enough to betray the fear building in his chest. And for a second there was nothing, just shadows stretching too far, silence hanging too long, and then something shifted, just enough to catch the edge of the beam, and Evan realized, in that instant, that the barge wasn't empty, that whatever had been inside those containers wasn't the only thing left behind, and that buying this place hadn't just given him shelter, it had pulled him into something he was never supposed to find. Evan didn't run when the figure stepped out of the darkness, even though every instinct told him to, because by then he understood this wasn't just an abandoned barge, and the man who emerged, thin, exhausted, but alert, introduced himself as Raymond Hale, someone who had been trapped there the night the vessel went down and had survived long enough to realize the truth. The barge hadn't sunk by accident. It had been deliberately left there, loaded with unstable government waste that was easier to hide than to properly dispose of, turning the wreck into a quiet containment site disguised as neglect, something officials could deny while still keeping an eye on it from a distance. And now Evan, a homeless 19-year-old who had bought it for $10, had unknowingly stepped into the middle of that secret. Raymond warned him to leave and forget everything, because people had come back before, making sure the site stayed buried. But Evan looked at the open container, the empty canisters, and the dark water around them and realized walking away would just keep the secret alive. So instead he made a different choice. He recorded everything he could, the cargo, the markings, Raymond's story, and within days of sending it out, the silence shattered, officials rushed in, the canal was shut down, and the barge disappeared under heavy guard. Its contents taken somewhere no one would ever admit to. Raymond vanished again, and Evan, who had been invisible to the world just days before, became the one person who refused to let something dangerous stay hidden, proving that sometimes the biggest secrets aren't protected by walls, but by the assumption that no one will ever look closely enough to find them.